right, so on Wednesday, we had been talking about using the growth rates lambda and R as an alternative, or possibly in addition to, looking at population abundance growth alongside our life tables. And so we worked through an example in class for human populations. And so we have an R growth rate of 0.01. Why did we use R instead of lambda here? Perfect, exactly, right? Humans aren't breeding on a cycle or within a season, right? We breed continuously. And so we have that R. All right, so we had gotten through this first example, right, of doing the I don't have my Epic pen up. That's what's going on. I'm not looking at it like, I don't know what to do. There. Okay, so remember, the fastest way to work through this one was to sort of ignore all of the billion or the zero part, right? There's some cheaty math. 7.7. And then I can't actually remember what the rest of it was off the top of my head. It was 3.9. I don't remember if there's another zero in there or not. All right, so that left us with basically 7.7 billion for next year. That's fine. Okay. That leaves us with our next question. Assuming our R remains constant, 50-50 on that, how would we figure out what the population would be in 25 years? Now we could do this 25 times by hand. Probably would not be unrealistic, but not exactly a ton of fun. So what would be the best way to tackle this? I asked you to do this and not said anything, what would you guys have done? Just done it by hand 25 times probably? It worked. I don't know if it'll work or not, actually. So what's the one problem you're going to run into with that, probably? Oh my goodness, times 25, there we go. Does not quite work. You're going to shortchange yourself on that one. So remember, every year, right, our population is going to go up. And so year 2, right, we should start with 7.78 times 0.01. Right, and the next year after that, whatever the next number is, my guess would be like 7.8 times 0.01. So we get progressively bigger. Each year we go to do this all 25 times. Stop. My best suggestion would be to do this. Use Excel to do it for you. Okay. So how would I write this formula so this is going to work for me? Some kind of sum, right? So this first one's easy, right? I want to take this times 0.01. Oops. Skip a step, hey. Just stop. 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 Like that. That. All right, so that was the number we added before, right? So your 2 is going to equal this plus this. All right, so that's my year 2, but where do I go from here now? Then we still need to add them. Exactly. So that's the fastest way to do it. I can drag that down as many years as I want. Okay. So when I do that, right, every time I do this, if I click on this cell, I can see what it's done from cell 9, taken the cell above it, times it by my growth rate, and then added it by the cell above it, right? It's just continued to copy that down. I've lazed it. Okay. But you guys have worked through what we need to always do, right? We take the year before, we're multiplying it by that growth rate, so we're getting what is the amount we need to add. That's that first number. That's what we found here. This is the amount of individuals we're adding. And then we actually need to, as the plus part, actually add them back into that original number, right? That's this last part. Let's then add them in to the previous year. Okay, so the first part of that equation is what's the proportion or the percent, the number that we're adding in, what's the newborn. Basically births minus deaths. Okay, and let's add that into the number that we had the previous year. And we can do that for as many years as we want to do. And obviously you guys can't pull up Excel during an exam, so I'm not going to ask you to do this for 25 years for an exam. But it's good practice to see what exactly are we doing here. Where are these numbers coming from? Does this make sense? Everybody see these values? Okay, so let's look at some of these growth rates then. So some of these species generally have like no growth rates. Remember for lambda, right, our baseline is 1, right? Okay, so lambda is around 1, R is around 0. So on here we can get an idea of what do actual growth rates look like. Now the human one we practiced with was also real. We know humans do weird things. Okay. This bottom example is a good one of what reintroduction looks like. Okay, so reindeer had gone extirpated. Do we know what the difference between extirpation and extinction is? What does extinction mean? They're completely dead, right? Dinosaurs are extinct. We don't have no dinosaurs. Okay, how might that differ from extirpation? Okay, so they're rare. Okay, extirpation means so they're dead, but they're only dead from a specific area. Okay, so reindeer were extirpated. From a specific area. So reindeer still exist in the world, okay, but not on St. Paul Island. Okay. The paddlefish, for example, was extirpated from West Virginia. It all died here. Paddlefish still existed, but not here. They were extirpated. Okay. So reindeer had been extirpated from St. Paul Island. They were reintroduced off the coast of Alaska. This is a common conservation effort thing. And we talked about this when we were doing our Eco-Evo conversation too. We had the gray wolves that were reintroduced to Isle Royale to help control the elk. Okay, so nearly 30 years later, okay, from 25 to 2000, so we have a lambda 1.18. We had increasing numbers, so we have a positive growth rate for that species. If both of these note are lambdas, okay, so these have breeding seasons, because this is very clear for a reindeer. They all have a birthing season, usually in late summer. For wild ginger, it almost seems strange. They have a growing season. Okay, just like you have a garden, many of those plants have a growing season. You would expect your lettuce to grow in the early spring. Those plants have lambdas. Okay. These are relatively small. We can think of, for example, in our blue box here, okay, some organisms can have crazy high lambdas. Okay, for example, the rice weevil. This is considered a pest in agriculture. It gets into the rice and destroys the crops. Okay, there's a lambda of 10 to the 17th. Okay, they still have breeding seasons. Most insects do. Okay, we can see this sort of visually. We saw this with our dragonflies when we were out collecting, right? You could see them all coming together and breeding on the lake. And then the dragonflies would lay their eggs. They would lay dormant until the next spring, and then they would all hatch. Same thing with rice weevils. There's just like a bajillion of them. Mice and voles are the same way. You did the modeling thing we did were with voles. I know it's not really the same, seeing like the circles run around on your screen. But any of those sort of like rodent populations are very similar. Sometimes they breed twice a year, but they still are doing it in specific seasons in batches. And oftentimes with these types of organisms, that's in parts so everyone can like meet up and actually find partners. This is common with small individuals. You've ever seen like hordes of flies, okay, It's not always because the food is there. That's their actual like breeding or giant orgies. Right? When you're small, finding a sexual partner is very difficult. Finding anybody is very difficult, and so they sort of like breed in mass. And we can certainly imagine bacteria. Well, it's weird to imagine that as lambda. You have to imagine that as bacteria. It's just that your lifespan is quite short. And so you're just doubling, often asexually, at the end of your lifespan or over a very specific time period. So that's lambda at 24 hours, right, or at 48 hours, or whatever it is, depending on the type of bacteria you are. So they're quite substantial. So good? Okay. Any questions about lambda and R? Okay, what their definitions are, how we apply them, or how we would use them? Okay, fabulous. So what we want to talk about next then is kind of how we've talked about all of our growth rates up to this stage have been like ad infinitum, right? When we start growing, we can grow forever. We know in the back of our head, and we sort of mentioned, like, oh, this is going to be a cap. Right? But all of our equations have been very J-shaped. And so we haven't talked about, well, what is that cap? What does it look like? And how does it work? So we really want to look at now, what does cause these caps, what we call regulation. And then what is it going to do to the graphs that we've been creating up to this point? Okay, so population regulation. So we know that certainly in an ideal space, that populations are growing. Okay, so we consider that lambda above 1. That's a frazzle. Lambda is greater than 1, right? R is greater than 0. Okay, so positive population growth. Okay, that 5 times fast. Okay, now, of course, we also know, certainly from several examples that we've played through, that it's rare that populations are staying at positive population growth. I keep doing it to myself. Is constant. So we do see that fluctuation, okay, moving from positive to negative, circling around 1. Okay, even the example we did with our life table, right, we had growth 1 year, a little bit of loss the next year. So given that, okay, growth is independent of density sometimes. Okay. Well, where we're going to spend I'm talking about is both. Okay. So independent of density, okay, it doesn't matter how many individuals in a population, that growth rate is going to change. Okay, but also, right, it can be a function of density. Okay. As you get more and more individuals, okay, that's going to have to alter how fast your growth rate goes, right? Having too many people in a room causes stress on being in that room. Right? It gets hard to move about, it gets hard to find food, makes you cranky. Okay? Very literally, right? Animals get aggressive, they get territorial. Plants can get aggressive with each other as well. And they can send off chemical signals that kill each other. It gets real weird. You just don't think about it. Okay, so let's talk about the first one, density independent. Okay, so things that don't matter how many people are in a room. Okay, so these tend to be abiotic factors. Okay. They also, as we see here, are very unpredictable. this is going to have a very large effect on our organisms. Okay, so if we have a year that's very, very hot, we have a drought year, and we have a lot of rain. If I have a lot of rain that washes away the soil that I need as a plant, these are all things that are going to affect how many individuals survive. Okay? My success at being able to breed in a given year. Okay? And it's absolutely irrelevant of how many of us there were to begin with, whether there was 5 or 500. But as with when we're dealing with weather or climate, it's super unpredictable. I can barely tell whether it's going to be sunny or cloudy from day to day anymore. Whether I need my coat or not. It's classic October. And droughts are very difficult to predict. Wildfires are very difficult to predict. Okay? So all of these things matter. Okay? They're going to matter to you just as much if there are 5 or 500 of you. Okay? It's still going to hurt or help your population. Okay? So it's equal opportunity effects. So I call these chance factors. So last year when it was super dry for a really long time, that would have affected a lot of organisms. And it didn't matter if you were in a forest that was very densely packed, stunk to be all of them. And it didn't matter if you were in a very sporadically set garden, where there was only maybe 4 or 5 little bushes. Okay? Both of those systems, densely packed or not densely packed, right? They both felt that drought equally the same, right? So that's density independent. This is going to affect your population, but not based on your density. Okay, conversely, density dependent factors. Okay, this matters based on how many individuals are in the room. Okay, so as your population grows or shrinks, so do these life table factors. Okay, so largely birth, death, and dispersal rates. Okay, so if we think about density increasing, okay, so you're getting more and more individuals in a single space. Okay. We tend to see birth rates increase at first, okay, but then you get that crank. Okay, too many people in a room. And that starts to actually suppress birth rates. Okay, so you have less individuals breeding at a given time. Okay, certainly and intuitively, death rates increase, more individuals around, so more individuals get eaten. Easier to pick them off, predators can find them easier, it's harder to run away, bump into people. Okay. There's less food to go around, right? You have to ration it more. Okay. Dispersal also tends to increase. I don't want to hang out with you guys anymore. Okay. don't have any elbow room. I don't have any food. I cannot breathe around you. And so I'm just literally going to walk away from this situation. And those situations intuitively, right, are going to decrease the pool of population in the room. And if we think about this birth rate one a little further, I know this one feels the least intuitive, right? You think more individuals, you should have more births, okay? Oftentimes, okay, birth, right, or the ability to be fecund is controlled by space. Okay, so how big is my burrow? So we have reduced space. Food, okay, do I have enough resources? So if I'm not maintaining weight or not made weight that year, particularly for females, I won't be able to become pregnant. Do we see this in humans, for example? Like anorexic females are unable to become pregnant. The same thing is the same with animals. Underweight animals won't become pregnant that year. Okay, and large, really, really, really large groups of animals, okay, also put off pheromones, right? A smell that dampens down birth capacity or litter size, so how many eggs that are released in a female. So you still may be able to become pregnant, but instead of, say, having 5 litters, so you released 5 eggs, you may have only released 2, so have a smaller litter size. And this is an energetic investment issue, right? I don't want to have 5 offspring. I don't want to invest 5 offspring if they're probably going to die, right? Because there's not enough food resources, or they're literally going to be sat on by the big fat male seal next to me because there's nowhere for them to be. Actual problems that happen in overrun colonies. Super sad and also super gross. Okay, so that's a lot of mechanisms by which our birth rates can decrease when we get these large densities. Okay, so these are all density dependent factors. Okay, so these are not abiotic effects. They're swiping through and wiping us clean, right? These are density dependent within population regulation that's sort of keeping us from continuously overrunning ourselves. Okay, so what happens when we run out of elbow room? Okay, any questions on this definition? Okay. So here's why this is important. As we look at population regulation, these density-dependent factors help when population abundance is low. Okay, so if we have few individuals, we have lots of elbow room, it can help increase the birth rate. Okay, you're not going to have a lot of individuals, so your death rate's not going to be very high. You're not going to be spreading around disease. It's not going to be easy to pick you off. Okay, so if we look at our graph here, here's our population density. Okay, so we would have low population density on the left, high population density on the right. On our dependent variable, we have our population growth rate. So in this case, lambda. Okay, so it would be, imagine somewhere in here, being more or less 1, or no growth, right? Below here, you would have decreasing. And above that bar, we have increasing, right? Or large lambdas, right? Lambdas greater than 1. Does everybody see our axes? Working at how we can break down graphs. And my one line's probably not perfect, but it's an estimate. Okay, so let's just look at the two extreme kind of segments here. If I have low population density, what's going on? Where's the bulk of my points and the point of my line? Above my one line, right? That means I have low density, greater than 1 lambda. So lower densities, I have a higher lambda, or a higher growth rate. My birth rates are higher than my death rates. Okay. I probably have low emigration. Okay. I don't have a high density. Disease isn't spreading easy. Harder for predators to find me. Okay. Releasing good pheromones. I can have big litter sizes. Food is easier to find. Okay. Let's have some bebés. And that goes good for quite a while, right? Until we reach a certain point, and we'll talk about what this certain point is. So then at high density, and what happens? Good. High density. Make myself enough space there. Okay. I have small or a smaller lambda. I want to slow that growth rate down, right? We're starting to run out of room. Okay. We're really close together. Disease is going to spread easier. Okay. We're getting picked off easier by predators. Individuals are starting to leave our group. Our birth rates are being depressed. So here we see the lambda still fluctuates, okay, but it's not fluctuating randomly. Okay? It's fluctuating in response, okay, to the size of my population. Okay. In this case, right, it helps the population stay around an abundance, a density, okay, that, as we'll find, the environment can support well. Still good? Okay, so as we think about this, And like we've sort of mentioned, things like food, okay, literal space, okay, how actual elbow room, even though we've been joking about that, and also spaces we think about things like nesting space or burrow space. Okay? These are all the sorts of resources that run into short supply, okay, to help regulate our population. If they can't find them, this is what's going to start stopping us up. So here's our big key. As we compare density independent versus density dependent. And remember, density independent factors matter. Right? They're going to mess up a population. We have a drought year, it's going to affect population size. Individuals are going to die. Okay? This isn't the same as regulating a population actively. Remember, it's random. There's not a pattern. We had a drought year. Individuals are going to die that year. We don't have drought years every time the population gets too big, right? Density independent factors are random. Effective, but random. Okay. Density dependent factors come into play every time the population size gets too big. So this is what we mean when we're talking about regulating. Okay, so when the population size gets too big for the food resources they have, individuals are going to die every single time. Not just once every 100 years when there's a massive wildfire, right? But every time. There's too many of them. Okay. So our density dependent has a pattern, and that's what we mean by a pattern. Right? You can depend on it, dependent, to come in as that population gets big. Density independent shows up when you throw a dart. The difference between those two very clear. Both are important, but different. Okay, any questions about density dependent versus density independent as we've defined them so far? And make sure these definitions are very clear and their application to what we've done. It's very Friday-y in here. Okay, so let's look at some. We haven't broken down a graph on our own in a while. All right, so tell me what this graph is saying. I even picked a plant, just for Dr. Watson. Okay, good. So down here we see increasing density. So I have an experiment. Okay. I'm going to go out, put a bunch of plots, and in each plot I'm going to successfully put more and more of these little fuzzy plants to a very sort of cruel amount. Shove them in there. Okay. So, okay, we see at first everything's fine. Okay, but as we get higher along this density, eventually we reach this cutoff point. Okay, so beyond this, okay, no more plants can survive, right? So we get to about 100 plants per meter square, and beyond that density, a little wonky here. Whatever, it's a log scale, so bear with me as we kind of guess numbers here. 200, whatever it is. Can't exactly draw straight lines. We'll say it's 100 for the sake of argument here. Okay. Beyond that density, these plants don't survive. What happens? What happens to our poor plants? They're all competing for these limited resources, right? They're all stuck in the same soil. So they're getting the same water, the same nitrogen, the same phosphorus, the same sunlight. Okay? So their roots are overlapping, their leaves are overlapping each other. And once we get past, right, whatever this number is, okay, too many peas in a pod, so to speak. Okay? There's not enough sunlight to go around. There's not enough water to go around. In this case, competition is going to be a huge driver of that, right? These guys can't get up and walk away. The dispersal is not going to be a huge driver here. Okay, so they're literally going to be killing each other off. Now, certainly, we can have predation be a piece here, right? You can have weevils or caterpillars or whatever the case is come in, and you can have significantly higher predation rates in these higher density. And we see that in agriculture all the time. It's a big problem with what we call monocultures. Literally meaning one planting. They're much more susceptible to predation or disease, right? Because diversity helps in so many ways, right? But it really helps prevent disease and predation because there's a mix of different organism types. So in this case, when you have a huge density of one thing, it becomes much more susceptible. Once a single bacteria, a single fungus, a single predator gets in there, it can just, it's heaven, right? It's heaven for this organism. And so certainly that's a huge component as well. So we have competition and predation probably driving down these high density numbers. They just can't survive. Right? And if I'm trying to breed, whatever the plant word for that is, right, in these areas, and even if I successfully pollinate, where are my seeds going to go? Certainly, if we think about here, good gracious, 1,000 plants in a meter squared, where am I going to drop my seeds? On top of the leaves of other plants? Okay, those are not going to be successful plant bebés, right? So the success of my offspring, even if I invest in creating them, is going to be extraordinarily low. Does that feel good? Any questions about this? Either the way we read the graphic or what it says.